So he offered 30,000 men? That's a lot. They said no. Well, was it political or military? Both. I don't know. 30,000 reinforcements, that's nothing to sneeze at. Huh? They know what they're doing. Well, how do you know? They say they do. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. See ya. August 6, 1950. They've been pushed back for a month now, the UN forces, but there just isn't anywhere left to be pushed back to now, and they will make their stand in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula, in the Pusan Perimeter. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the ROK, the South Koreans, held off the KPA, the Army of the North, on the East Coast, thanks to help from UN airstrikes and naval gunfire. But in the center, the KPA advanced. The green new American troop arrivals still had a tendency to panic. The British decided that they will send in ground troops, but will that be in time? For there was an undetected KPA division, the 6th Division, that had hooked around Daejeon, driven south, and swung eastward, and it is now an existential threat to the UN forces. As this week gets going, it's closing in on Masan, just 50 or so kilometers from the port of Pusan. If they reach Pusan, the Americans and a lot of the ROK will be surrounded with no escape. Well, very little chance of escape, anyhow. This is a huge threat. And last week, Walton Walker, U.S. 8th Army commander, began trying to meet it once it was finally identified, ordering the 24th Infantry Division, under John Church since July 23rd, to cover the whole area from Chinju to Gimcheong. That's like 100 kilometers of territory with mountains running across the middle of it. The 3 regiments of the 24th Division were all still reeling from their combat duties and were all under strength as well. The 19th Regiment got orders to head from Chinju to seize Hadong. But this became an absolute disaster for the Americans, with men in the hundreds being taken prisoners by the KPA, who were by then doing this end around with 2 divisions, the 6th on the outside and the 4th on the inside. 34th Regiment from 24th Division, which only has a strength of 1,150 men, was at Gochang by the 27th. KPA 4th Division troops easily brushed aside the Americans and ROK at Anhui and hit Gochang the 29th, forcing the 34th to withdraw, cutting off and decimating, well, killing way more men than literally decimating entire battalions. They continued to press the attack, leaving their own artillery at Gochang, knowing that the bridges ahead have been destroyed. It isn't until this week begins, July 31st, that 8th Army realizes they face 4th Division at Gochang and 6th Division at Chinju. They think 4th is trying to surround the main positions on 8th Army's left flank, and 6th is going to drive around that from Chinju, cut off communications in the rear, head through Masan, and seize the port of Pusan. The enemy reached Chinju at the end of last week. The 19th Infantry there gives its strength as 1,895 men. That is it. They do, though, get 600 reinforcements, the 30th. The fighting outside the town gets going that evening, but the main KPA attacks begin that night with a barrage at 2:15 in the morning. By 3 a.m., the infantry is engaging. By morning, the Americans are preparing to evacuate Chinju as the enemy begins reaching its western edges. It takes a few hours, but it is fairly orderly. By the evening, the KPA has 4,000 or so men in Chinju setting up communications. A side note here is that there were 3 beat-up but working American M26 medium Pershing tanks found in storage in Japan last month, which arrived in Chinju the 28th, the first medium tanks in Korea for the UN forces. They don't take part in the battle, and there is a fair amount of drama trying to get them out of there. This ultimately fails thanks to blown bridges and an overheating engine. There is also drama with the 1st Battalion of the 19th Infantry at Sancheong, unaware that the rest of the regiment has pulled out of Chinju, but they have a happier ending, escaping to the east. Still, July ends with North Korean triumph. They have taken Chinju and are ready to march on Masan and Pusan. On August 2nd, the 19th Infantry, backed with elements of the 29th Infantry and the ROK, tries a counterattack east of Chinju. They actually have M4 medium tanks with them, the second group of American medium tanks brought to Korea. That attack at the Notch. And a second fight at Qingdong-ni means, however, that after a week of engagement with the UN forces, the North Korean 6th Division is now down to around half strength and must regroup before trying again to reach Masan. Of course, their opposition is hardly in a better state. Thing is, the North Koreans have succeeded in forcing U.S. 8th Army to reinforce here at the expense of the Central Front and to redeploy along a shorter line, one behind the Naktong River, that will be known as the Pusan Perimeter. Now, on August 1st, William Keene's 25th Division is moving to new defense positions south of Chinju after the fighting around there last week. At 3 p.m., though, he gets the call to head south to Samnanjing on the Naktong River. Once there, they are to block the enemy from advancing eastward while preparing themselves to attack westward. The destination is changed to Masan the next day, so by the evening of the 2nd, 25th Division is in and around Masan. Keene assumes local command of all UN troops south of the bend in the Naktong River. The Naktong River down there is under a kilometer wide, which is still pretty wide, but is shallow enough to be fordable in some places. However, it is commanded by steep ranges of hills on both banks, and half of Walker's new perimeter is along this line. As the Americans have dug in, loads of artillery and armor is being unloaded at Pusan. I mentioned last week that, despite what people believe, the UN forces now outnumber the KPA in Korea. Sure, the American infantry divisions have been badly hurt over the past few weeks, and morale is really low, but reinforcements reach Korea week after week after week. It is a measure of the psychological dominance the communists had achieved at this time that most Americans would have been frankly disbelieving had they been told that the UN forces by now outnumbered the North Koreans significantly and outgunned them overwhelmingly. The ferocity and suicidal recklessness of the massed attacks of Kim Il-sung's units, night after night through those weeks, gave the defenders the impression of an Asian horde with limitless supplies of manpower. In reality, the North Koreans were squandering their dwindling reserves of armor, ammunition, and trained men. Kim Il-sung, North Korea's leader, is, of course, well aware of this. He and his command very much understand the urgency of breaking through and reaching Pusan before the UN buildup of men and equipment makes that impossible. On the 1st of August, Walker issues then the operational directive for the UN forces' withdrawal across the Naktong. In general, the 3 American divisions manage this okay. There are some units that are still heavily engaged, but the only tragedy, and as so often it is one for the refugees, has to do with the railroad and highway bridges at Withdrawn on the Naktong. These are pretty much the most important ones on the river at the moment, and are supposed to be blown as soon as all of 1st Cavalry Division has crossed. Hap Gay, division commander, has given orders that no one but he can order their demolition. Late in the day on the 3rd, the rear guard, 8th Cavalry, starts across the bridge, and the mass of thousands of refugees follows. The division commander ordered the rearguard to return to the west side and hold back the refugees. When all was ready, the troops were to run across to the east side so the bridge could be blown. This plan was tried several times, but in each instance, the refugees were on the heels of the rearguard. Finally, when it was nearly dark, General Gay, feeling that he had no alternative, gave the order to blow the bridge. It was a hard decision to make, for hundreds of refugees were lost when the bridge was demolished. Even just by mid-July, 380,000 refugees were estimated to be in ROK-controlled territory. That territory has now shrunk quite a bit, but the number of refugees only grows. It's no longer growing 25,000 a day like it was at its peak, but it is a dire state of affairs. So, by the morning of the 4th, 8th Army is in defensive positions on its side of the river. North and east of Withdrawn, the ROK holds the line, though they do have some serious fighting the 2 days it takes to get into position. Also, the 2-week-long battle for Yeongdeok on the east coast ends this week, and it ends in the UN forces' favor. Yep, the fighting is constant until the 2nd, when around 6 p.m., the ROK 3rd Division pushes the North Korean 5th Division out of the town and even pursues them northward. However, after a few days' pause, the North Koreans attack again on the 5th and drive the ROK to positions south of the town, where they remain as the week ends. By the end of this week, though, the ground situation in Korea has actually stabilized to a large degree, and the Pusan Perimeter is firmly established. This is rectangular-ish, and about 150 kilometers north to south and maybe 80 east to west. The Naktong River is the western boundary, except for the bit at the south below where the river flows to the east. The northern boundary is a curly line through the mountains from above Waigwan to Yeongdeok on the coast, or just below Yeongdeok at the moment. The UN forces deployed. From southwest to northeast are US 25th Division, then 24th, then 1st Cavalry, then ROK 1st, 6th, Capital, 8th, and 3rd Divisions. Opposite 25th are the North Korean 6th Division and the 83rd Motorized Regiment. Opposite 24th is North Korean 4th Division. Opposite 1st Cavalry, 3rd Division. And north of Waigwan, west to east, we have North Korean 15th, 13th, 1st, 8th, 12th, and 5th. The KPA is already trying to cross the Naktong, though. The night of the 5th are 2 attempts north of Waigwan and a third, dangerous one, some 50 kilometers south of Waigwan by North Korean 4th Division opposite Yongsan in the Naktong River Bulge. The KPA cross in force today as the week ends, and though there are bloody counterattacks and fighting in which over 50% of company-sized units are killed on both sides and bodies litter the ground, as the week ends, there are loads of North Korean troops on the UN side within the Naktong Bulge. I've mentioned several times before that early in July, overall UN Commander Douglas MacArthur told US President Harry Truman they'd need at least 4 more divisions on the ground in Korea. That alarmed Truman by itself. But a week later, MacArthur modified it to say they'd need an additional field army of 4 more divisions with support. So a presidential mission has been sent to Tokyo, led by former ambassador to both London and Moscow, Avril Harriman. MacArthur meets them there today, the 6th. In a brilliant, unscripted presentation lasting 2.5 hours, MacArthur decisively convinced them of his need for massive reinforcement. At the same time, he took the opportunity to outline the Chromite plan to them. It was intended as the decisive war-winning counterstroke, a major amphibious landing well in the enemy rear, the sort of envelopment he had perfected in the Pacific. The objective of the plan was the port of Incheon, within easy striking distance of the main airbase at Gimpo and Seoul itself. It was also 180 miles behind the lines of the North Korean army investing the Pusan Perimeter. MacArthur knew it to be a huge gamble. That's not all he has to say at this meeting. He goes on about Taiwan, and that if the communist Chinese forces were foolish enough to attack it, he would personally fly there and direct its defense, and deliver such a crushing defeat, it would be one of the decisive battles of the world, a disaster so great it would rock Asia and perhaps turn back communism. He doesn't think it likely they would attack, but still. I'll talk more about that in a minute, though, when I talk about China. Now back to the Incheon plan. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, when they hear about it, are not so thrilled about this plan. But MacArthur is firm that this is the only way, literally the only way, to get back the strategic initiative and turn the war around. He says the North can get reinforcements faster than the UN can deliver them to the South. And taking Incheon, Gimpo, and of course Seoul, the capital, would cut off the whole logistical system that is sustaining the KPA in the South. Once that's cut, 8th Army would be able to drive them all the way to the 38th parallel and beyond. The planning for this has already been underway for a few weeks. The head of the U.S. Fleet Marine Force, Lem Shepard, came to MacArthur a while ago offering to pull together a full division of Marines from all over the world. Mac says, great, and then decides to form 10th Corps to be commanded by his Chief of Staff, Ed Almond, which will be this 1st Marine Division, along with 7th Infantry Division. This corps will go under MacArthur's overall direct command, and not Walker's 8th Army. Okay, last week I talked about MacArthur going to visit Chiang Kai-shek personally on Taiwan to turn down Chiang's offer of 30,000 of his Chinese nationalist troops for Korea, a meeting which actually happens as this week begins, July 31st. And I'd like to say a few words about the China situation now. See, the Americans and the British have different views of things in terms of China. American Secretary of State Dean Acheson thinks Mao Zedong's communist China is going to act as a Soviet satellite for the near future, kind of like what he thinks the North Koreans are doing now. He's worried not just that Mao's forces might overrun Chiang's on Taiwan, but that if China is part of the Soviet issue, then Taiwan in Soviet hands would undermine the entire American position in the Western Pacific. Thing is, the British, and others, Canada for instance, do distinguish between Chinese and Soviet communism. They don't see China as a satellite for the Soviets like North Korea. Back in January, Britain actually recognized Mao's regime, and the last thing the British want is isolation driving communist China into Soviet arms. This approach was justified on broad political and strategic grounds. Britain faces a Soviet threat in Europe and the Middle East and was unwilling to add China to its problems. Hong Kong was a permanent hostage to China, and the situation in Malaya, where communist insurgency had broken out in 1948, could only be worsened by conflict with Beijing. Moreover, China was a Commonwealth issue. Despite Indian independence in 1947, Britain had not abandoned hopes of an Indian contribution to Middle East defense in the event of war. Nehru saw the Chinese Revolution as an expression of Asian nationalism. He wished to act as a bridge between the new China and the West and opposed any attempt to isolate Mao's regime. While India voted for the UN action in Korea, Nehru was an outspoken critic of U.S. action in the Taiwan Straits. That last is important. See, we've seen that the U.S. 7th Fleet is patrolling off Taiwan in case of invasion by the communists. But the British do not want to run risks on behalf of Chiang, who's been pretty discredited by now. So British ships assigned to that U.S. fleet under MacArthur's overall command are forbidden from patrolling those waters. They don't want the Taiwan situation blowing up into an extension of the Korea situation. Acheson has been trying to keep distance between the U.S. and Chiang too, but that's pretty hard. For Chiang, Taiwan is a stepping stone to reconquer mainland China. For the U.S., Taiwan is a strategic position that must be kept out of enemy hands. Chiang was bluntly warned in July that attacking the mainland while using the 7th Fleet as a shield is verboten. It would be an unfriendly act. There was a fine distinction between defending Taiwan and aiding Chiang, which was difficult to apply in practice. At the end of July, the National Security Council agreed to a program of military aid to improve the defenses of the island, a step which involved cooperation with the nationalist regime. The administration had little alternative. If it wished to hold Taiwan, it had to use the available material, Chiang's army. It was explained to the Allies that the U.S. intended to supply guns and tanks for purely defensive purposes. It had no intention of promoting an invasion of the mainland. It is doubtful Beijing viewed matters in this perspective. Washington was arming its political enemies and preventing the final acts of the Civil War. In August, through the Russians, China accused the Americans of aggression at the United Nations. The Pentagon did, 2 weeks ago, recommend that Chiang be allowed to make airstrikes on troop concentrations on the Chinese mainland, which Acheson nixed. This brings me back to MacArthur and his plan to personally defend Taiwan if the communists attack it, and all the Taiwan stuff he says at the August 6th meeting. He tells Harriman that he's against the bombing ban, but Harriman explains the need for UN unity and not giving the Soviets a wedge to use like Taiwan trouble could be. Harriman leaves Tokyo not entirely convinced MacArthur is really down with the official line, but here lies a real problem. MacArthur, as commander in the Far East, is responsible for the defense of Taiwan just as he is for Korea. And considering his sympathy for Chiang, in retrospect, it might not have been a good idea for one person to have military responsibility for both places. His visit to Chiang provokes fears in D.C. that he is going to start a wider war. Of course, such a visit is his right, technically, as area commander, but he did not consult Acheson, who would likely have opposed the UN commander in Korea visiting the political dynamite of Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan. And in something of a snub to Washington, MacArthur does not bring any diplomatic personnel with him. MacArthur tells Chiang straight out that at least he supports bombing the mainland, and he arranges for basing 3 U.S. air squadrons on Taiwan. Truman and Atchison then go into containment mode, canceling the air squadron deployment and strongly emphasizing that only the president can authorize bombing raids on the Chinese mainland. Well, I fear that there will be a lot more to discuss with regard to Mao, Chiang, Taiwan, and China over the coming weeks. We shall see. But this week of the Korean War is over, with the China situation sticky, refugee problems only growing and growing, and with the UN forces hemmed in on all sides in the Pusan Perimeter. But, although there is still plenty of action, the front seems to be finally stabilizing. MacArthur even has a plan to turn it all around. But Walker's army will have to hold on until that plan can get off the ground. Max Hastings writes in the Korean War, "By now, 8th Army's commander knew that both his men and the North Koreans had run out of room for ground maneuvers. The defenders must stand and fight. On the high ground, behind the great loop of the Naktong River, they would command positions of great natural strength. In the first days of August, the long files of dusty, exhausted Americans and their overloaded vehicles trudged doggedly south and east to the new line. Here, on the last mountain mass before the sea, the fate of Walker's army, of the United Nations in Korea, would be decided." You can't deny that the uncertainty of it all is certainly exciting. You can prevent any uncertainty of us being able to continue this coverage of the war by joining the Time Ghost Army. It is the army that allows all of this. You can join at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers, and Brent Messner is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.